Charles Vance, a 48-year-old lead of compliance and project strategy at Apex Operations, had spent his entire career mastering the art of professional patience. In his 25 years in corporate operations, he had learned that the loudest voices in the room were often the emptiest. Charlie, as his colleagues called him, was not a man of loud pronouncements. He was a man of checklists, audit logs, and silent calculations. He was the strategist who worked behind the scenes, ensuring that Apex Operations remained aligned with federal regulations while securing lucrative contracts. His graying hair and calm expression often led people to mistake his quiet nature for compliance, but those who worked closely with him knew better. His mind was always moving, cataloging details that others missed, and preparing for scenarios that others failed to anticipate. He believed that the corporate world was governed by rules, and those who ignored the rules would eventually trip over them. He arrived at the office early every morning, typically by 7 in the morning, to enjoy a cup of hot black coffee in the quiet before the phones began to ring. It was during these peaceful hours that he did his best thinking, reviewing compliance manuals and mapping out project timelines with methodical care. Currently, Charlie was leading the compliance and operational framework for a joint bid with Kincaid Group. The two companies had partnered to secure a $500 million federal infrastructure contract, an enormous opportunity that had required 18 months of grueling, late-night strategy sessions. Charlie had designed the entire operational architecture from scratch, blending procurement lanes, logistics models, and compliance checks into a seamless plan. It was his masterpiece, represented by a one-slide summary that made complex federal regulations look simple. The proposal was designed to restructure transportation corridors across 3 states, and every detail had to be perfect to pass federal scrutiny. Charlie had spent countless weekends verifying every line of the document, ensuring that Apex Operations was positioned as the primary execution partner. He knew that federal procurement officers looked for any small inconsistency to disqualify bidders, so his focus was on absolute perfection. The critical alignment meeting took place on a Tuesday morning via Zoom. Representatives from both companies, along with 2 silent federal observers, were present on the call. Charlie was systematically walking the team through the final task allocations and the logistics scope. He was explaining how the compliance requirements would tie into the procurement milestones when Gerald Higgins, the hiring manager at Kincaid Group, cut him off mid-sentence. Gerald was a loud, aggressive manager who wore his ambition like cheap cologne. He scoffed into his microphone, wagged his finger at his camera, and barked, "I do not care who you are. This is a delivery conversation." The reaction was immediate. A heavy, stunned silence fell over the call. On the Apex Operations side of the screen, jaws clenched and eyebrows raised. On the Kincaid Group side, team members suddenly found their coffee mugs and keyboards fascinating, refusing to make eye contact with the camera. Larry Fowler, the chief executive officer of Apex Operations, cleared his throat with a nervous chuckle. "Let us all stay focused on the big picture here," Larry mumbled, clearly hoping to sweep the tension under the rug before the weekend. He was a leader who preferred comfort over confrontation, always hoping that minor conflicts would resolve themselves without his intervention. Charlie did not raise his voice. He did not object or argue. He simply clicked the mute button on his microphone and sat back in his chair. He had learned long ago that silence, when wielded with precision, carried far more weight than immediate outrage. It allowed the offender to stew in their own arrogance without a lifeline. Charlie watched Gerald continue his lecture, his voice bouncing with unearned confidence, entirely unaware of the shift that had just occurred. Charlie was not wounded by the insult. He was merely observing it as a data point. In his experience, managers who reacted with such public hostility were almost always hiding their own operational deficiencies. He knew that the corporate structure would not tolerate such open disrespect, especially in front of federal observers. Charlie clicked out of the shared presentation and opened a private encrypted folder on his desktop labeled Kincaid Restructure. Inside were screenshots, flagged emails, and internal timelines. Charlie had started this file 2 months prior, recognizing that Gerald Higgins was the type of manager who treated compliance policies as mere suggestions. As Charlie stared at the screen, he recalled an email he had received from Gerald 3 years ago. At the time, Gerald had tried to recruit Charlie to join Kincaid Group as their director of operations. When Charlie politely declined the offer, Gerald had responded with a toxic, condescending message. Arrogant guys like you who think they are too smart always find out they are replaceable. We will be fine, and you will regret saying no. Charlie had not responded to the email. He had simply forwarded it to Evelyn Croft, the senior counsel at Apex Operations, with a brief note and archived it in his personal records. Now that same email felt like a dormant landmine. Charlie clicked print to PDF, saving it into his Kincaid contingency folder under the title of Kincaid Clause 9.1 Contingency. He was not acting out of anger, he was acting out of precision. He was building a comprehensive paper trail, knowing that Gerald Higgins had just stepped off a cliff in clown shoes. He knew that in federal bidding, historical behavior and professional conduct were highly regulated. The joint venture agreement they had signed contained strict guidelines regarding mutual respect and team integrity, and Gerald had just violated the spirit of that agreement on record. Charlie closed the folder, took a slow sip of his coffee, and waited for the meeting to end. He would let Kincaid Group believe they were in control for now, but the documentation was already beginning to assemble itself in the background. The quiet strategist knew that corporate battles were won not by those who shouted, but by those who kept the best records, and Charlie Vance had the best records in the business. The next morning, Charlie checked his inbox and noted that the daily sync thread for the joint bid had not arrived. This was a thread he had personally established and moderated for 10 months, serving as the central nervous system for the joint venture. He checked his permissions and realized he had been removed from the calendar invitation. It was not a technical glitch. By noon, Kincaid Group was rolling out new red lines to the project charter, and Charlie's name had been completely stripped from the document headers. The task matrix he had meticulously designed was still there, but it had been color-coded and rebranded as Kincaid's collaborative framework. They were keeping his structure but discarding his name. At 1:13 in the afternoon, a direct message from Larry Fowler popped up on Charlie's screen. "Hey Charlie, quick note. Kincaid is pushing for a simpler project structure. Too many voices in the mix. They want a single point of contact on our side, and they have requested it be someone else. It is not personal, just politics." Charlie stared at the message for a moment. He typed out a detailed explanation of the compliance risks involved in removing the primary strategist, then deleted it. He typed another response and deleted that too. Finally, he simply wrote, "Noted. Let me know how I can best support." He knew that arguing with Larry was pointless. Larry was already intimidated by Kincaid's size and was willing to sacrifice his own people to keep the peace. The CCO believed that as long as the bid succeeded, the internal structure did not matter. He did not understand that compliance was not a rubber stamp, but a complex series of checks and balances that required constant vigilance. Larry was looking for a path of least resistance, not realizing that Kincaid was slowly cutting away Apex's control. But Charlie was not supporting their rewrite. He was establishing a fresh, private workspace in his system. Every email where he was omitted, every document revision that stripped his name, and every unauthorized file access was cataloged. He rerouted his inbox filters to flag any correspondence containing Kincaid keywords. Every time a colleague accidentally copied him on a thread, he saved it. Every time he was left out of a meeting but received the notes later, he took screenshots of the distribution lists. He was creating a detailed map of their exclusion campaign, proving that they were systematically removing the only compliance officer assigned to the project. This was a critical error on Kincaid's part, as federal guidelines mandated the active involvement of certified compliance personnel. He cataloged these adjustments under a file named Kincaid Restructure Activity, preparing for the day when these documents would be requested by the auditors. A week passed, and Charlie was officially transitioned from strategy lead to silent administrative support. The Slack channels he had initiated were archived, and Kincaid's lead project manager, Bradley Kent, stopped replying to his comments on the shared tracking board. Bradley was a spreadsheet analyst who operated with the emotional range of a calculator. He viewed Charlie as an obstacle to Kincaid's total control of the project. When Charlie flagged a critical budget mismatch between Phase 2 and Phase 3 of the procurement timeline, Bradley dismissed it with a brief message. "We will discuss this with leadership." The mismatch Charlie had identified was not minor. It was a budget discrepancy of $45,000 that would trigger automatic audits by the Federal Oversight Board. Bradley's dismissal showed a complete lack of concern for regulatory compliance. Charlie did not push the issue. Instead, he created duplicate copies of the active files and compared them side by side. He highlighted proprietary terms that Kincaid was copying directly from his drafts into their presentation decks. Terms Charlie had coined during late-night planning sessions, such as operational cascade realignment and proactive schedule integration, were now appearing in Kincaid's slides as their own innovations. They were stealing his intellect while telling the world he was redundant. He watched as they changed the background colors of the slides, believing that a new visual theme could hide the plagiarism of complex operational algorithms he had spent months developing. On Thursday afternoon, Charlie sat silently through a preparation call where Bradley Kent walked the team through the updated project schedule. It was Charlie's exact schedule, word for word, with Bradley's name on the cover slide. Bradley struggled to explain some of the more complex scheduling parameters, stuttering over terms he did not understand, yet he arrogantly accepted the praise from the executives. After the call, Charlie received an email from the Chief Operating Officer of Apex. "Charlie, thanks for sitting in today. Appreciate you letting Kincaid take the lead. Big picture, it is cleaner this way. Let me know if anything urgent needs documenting." Charlie opened his voice recorder and made a note, Thursday at 2:47 in the afternoon. Chief Operating Officer refers to Kincaid's presentation as their own, though the material matches version 10.3 of my drafts from March. Edits confirmed. He then checked the server access logs and found that Bradley Kent had accessed Apex's restricted folders at 2:14 in the morning on Saturday. It was the secure folder where the original red-line drafts were stored. Kincaid had no authorization to access that directory. Bradley had used a temporary login to bypass the standard security protocols, thinking no one would check the logs over the weekend. Charlie quietly recorded a video of the access log, encrypted the file, and saved it. He now had proof of digital intrusion, a serious violation of their joint security agreement. This was the second major piece of evidence he needed, confirming that Kincaid's team was not just playing political games, but actively committing industrial theft. He stored these files in a secondary repository, ensuring that his records remained secure and inaccessible to Kincaid's technicians. It was during the second preparation meeting with the federal liaison that Kincaid Group made their most arrogant mistake. Bradley Kent was presenting the proposal architecture, explaining how their framework would handle the project flow. Bradley pointed to the screen and said, "By implementing parallelized task clusters, we ensure zero resource cannibalization across the contractor groups." Charlie did not flinch. He sat in silence looking at the slide. Parallelized task clusters was a term Charlie had invented during a late-night session while trying to describe overlapping subcontractor timelines. He had spent hours at 2 in the morning drawing diagrams on a dry erase board, working out how different phases could overlap without wasting resources. He had worried the term was too technical, but he had kept it in a footnote on page 12 of version 10.3 of his restricted draft. This draft had only been distributed to 6 executives at Apex Operations and 1 internal legal reviewer. It had never been shared with Kincaid Group. Bradley was reading it aloud as if it were his own discovery, presenting the concept to the federal observers with a smug grin. The federal observers, led by a strict compliance officer named Margaret, took diligent notes, unaware that the innovative methodology they were praising had been stolen from the silent strategist sitting in the second row of the video grid. Margaret nodded with interest, asking Bradley to elaborate on the mathematical models supporting these clusters. Bradley stammered, offering vague jargon about industry standards. while Charlie calmly recorded the interaction. As soon as the call concluded, Charlie opened the server audit log. He tracked the IP address that had accessed the restricted directory at 2:14 in the morning on Saturday. The account used was a temporary sandbox user account created for Kincaid's integration testing, which was supposed to be isolated from the main folders. The log showed a session lasting 47 minutes, during which 3 restricted drafts were downloaded. The metadata on the files confirmed the downloader was Bradley Kent. He had not even bothered to rename the downloaded files, leaving the internal Apex tracking numbers intact. He had simply copied the files onto an external device, assuming that the temporary nature of the sandbox account would shield his actions from scrutiny. Charlie used a file integrity verification script to run a cryptographic signature check on the downloaded document. The results were conclusive. The digital checksum matched page 12 of version 10.3 exactly. Charlie did not call a meeting or demand an apology. Instead, he drafted a precise professional email to Evelyn Croft, the senior counsel at Apex Operations. The email contained no emotion, only clear bullet points. Subject: unauthorized file access and proprietary data mismatch. Bradley Kent, Kincaid Group. Sandbox account integration breach on Saturday morning. 3 restricted drafts downloaded. Proprietary strategy language used verbatim in client-facing presentations. Supporting evidence attached. He sent this email directly to the legal department. Charlie detailed how the sandbox account had been created solely for database compatibility checks, and how Bradley had deliberately bypassed these restricted boundaries. He explained that this was not a simple mistake, but a deliberate bypass of our digital security. Charlie knew that this was not merely a case of plagiarism. In federal procurement, presenting another firm's proprietary data as one's own without authorization is a severe ethical violation. Furthermore, under their joint bidding agreement, Kincaid Group owed Apex Operations a duty of honesty and loyalty. By using a sandbox testing account to bypass security protocols and download restricted files, Kincaid had committed a clear breach of fiduciary duty. This legal concept required partners to act in the utmost good faith, and Kincaid's actions were the exact opposite. A breach of fiduciary duty of this magnitude was enough to dissolve the partnership under state law. It violated the core principles of mutual trust that govern joint ventures, making it impossible to continue the collaboration. Charlie felt a sense of cold clarity as he saved the draft. He knew that the law was on his side, and that Kincaid had handed him the perfect legal lever to dismantle their partnership. He updated his private log, noting the exact timestamps of the file access, the terminology used by Bradley, and the notifications sent to the legal department. He was not just tracking their mistakes, he was building the legal foundation to nullify their joint venture. The agreement they had signed was clear. Any material breach of faith or failure to protect proprietary data would render the memorandum of understanding void. Charlie was preparing the tools that would make their contract void ab initio, ensuring that when the hammer fell, it would erase Kincaid's involvement entirely. He spent the evening cross-referencing federal acquisition regulations, finding 3 distinct sections that penalized unauthorized data retrieval during joint bidding. He added these citations to his folder, creating a digital dossier that grew stronger with every passing day. Kincaid Group thought they were playing a game of corporate chess, but they had failed to realize that Charlie had already mapped out the entire board. He knew that when the Federal Review Board discovered that the core strategy was built on stolen data, they would have no choice but to disqualify the joint bid. Charlie was patiently waiting for the right moment to present the evidence, ensuring that Kincaid's own hubris would be their undoing. He reviewed his checklists, locked his screen, and walked out of the office into the cool evening, confident in the precision of his calculations. He walked to the train station, enjoying the silence of the night, knowing that his preparation was flawless and that Kincaid's team was walking into a trap of their own making. Charlie turned his attention back to the email Gerald Higgins had sent him 3 years ago. The email, filled with hostile and dismissive language, was now a critical piece of evidence. Under the Joint Bidding Memorandum of Understanding, specifically Clause 9.1c, both companies had agreed to a strict code of ethical conduct. The clause stated that any history of discriminatory behavior, professional misconduct, or unresolved ethical disputes involving team leaders must be disclosed, and could be grounds for the immediate termination of the partnership. Gerald's email was not just an insult. It was documented evidence of hostility that had now translated into the current project's execution. Charlie compiled the historical correspondence, the recent Zoom call transcript, and the evidence of Kincaid's systematic exclusion of his role and submitted it to Evelyn Croft. He knew that Gerald Higgins, in his rush to assert dominance, had created the perfect weapon for his own destruction. Gerald had assumed that his words would remain forgotten in an old inbox, but Charlie was a man who never threw away a receipt. The email proved a pattern of retaliatory behavior, which federal compliance boards took very seriously. He knew that Kincaid's failure to disclose this history was a direct violation of Clause 9.1c, providing Apex with the legal leverage needed to terminate the joint venture. He and Evelyn reviewed the document together, noting how Gerald's language directly conflicted with federal contractor guidelines. Evelyn agreed that the language was a clear breach of the ethical standards required for federal project leaders, and she immediately logged the document in the formal corporate record. During a final compliance review call on Friday, Brenda Shaw, a director at Kincaid Group, made a critical error. While discussing the proposed team structure, she looked at the slide containing the senior advisors and laughed. "We had to make this proposal a little less dinosaur-heavy, or the Federal Review Board might think we are running a retirement home instead of a delivery contract," she said, chuckling at her own joke. A brief, uncomfortable silence followed before the conversation resumed. Charlie did not react. He simply noted the timestamp and recorded the exact words. Brenda Shaw, Slide 14, dinosaur-heavy comment. It was a blatant display of age discrimination, violating both federal acquisition regulations and the Age Discrimination in Employment Act. In federal bidding, any documentation of ageist or discriminatory remarks by a partner firm's leadership can disqualify the entire bid and lead to debarment. The federal government had zero tolerance for discrimination, and Brenda's casual joke was a direct violation of compliance guidelines. Charlie knew that the federal observers on the call would be required to report this comment to their supervisors, adding another layer of compliance risk to Kincaid's proposal. He logged the details in his Notion workspace under compliance breaches, noting that the comment had been made in front of 3 federal observers. This recorded ageist remark was a clear violation of equal opportunity laws, which would be fatal to the joint bid under federal procurement ethics. He compiled the audio recording and the transcript, highlighting Brenda's exact phrasing for the legal team. He knew that this comment would prove that Kincaid's leadership maintained a culture of bias, which was an automatic grounds for disqualification under federal acquisition regulations. The following morning, Larry Fowler called Charlie into his office. Larry looked exhausted, his shoulders slumped as he sat at his desk. "Charlie, the compliance team is raising some questions before the final joint sign-off. They are asking about Kincaid's history and the partnership structure. Is there anything we should anticipate?" Larry hesitated, looking down at his desk. Kincaid's team hinted that we might receive a larger share of the operational management fees if we let them restructure the hierarchy. They suggested we could increase our margins. I wanted to see if you thought that was viable. Charlie looked directly at his CEO. "Evelyn Croft has the files, Larry. The documentation speaks for itself. Kincaid is offering you a minor financial incentive now so that they can claim sole credit for the strategy later. Once the contract is signed, they will use their majority position to squeeze us out entirely. It is a classic corporate trap, and if we accept, we will be complicit in their compliance violations. We must reject their offer immediately." Larry nodded slowly, a look of quiet dread crossing his face. He was beginning to realize that the quiet strategist they had pushed aside had spent the last several weeks building a fortress. Charlie had not yelled, complained, or demanded recognition. He had simply sat in his office, recorded every violation, and waited for Kincaid to destroy themselves. Charlie walked back to his desk, feeling the familiar calm of a strategist whose plan was falling into place. He checked his system and saw that Evelyn had already initiated a formal inquiry with the compliance board. The trap was set, and Kincaid was walking directly into it, completely unaware that their $500 million bid was about to vanish. The quiet compliance officer had turned their own arrogance into a legal net, and there was no escape for them. He sat at his computer and drafted the final timeline, checking each entry for absolute accuracy. He knew that the ageism comment combined with the security breach would give Apex the ultimate leverage. After finishing his work on Friday evening, Charlie went home and enjoyed a quiet weekend. He cooked a simple dinner of grilled salmon and fresh vegetables and sat on his porch listening to the crickets. He reflected on the nature of corporate greed and how easily people like Gerald Higgins and Brenda Shaw exposed themselves through their own lack of discipline. The quiet professional knew that patience was a virtue and that by Monday morning, Kincaid's team would face the full consequences of their actions. He went to bed early, feeling relaxed and prepared. 3 days before the final presentation to the Federal Review Board, Larry Fowler called an emergency alignment huddle. Kincaid Group had submitted the final organizational chart to the federal database, and Charlie's name was entirely absent, replaced by Bradley Kent as the lead strategist. During the virtual meeting, Charlie shared his screen and opened the federal guidelines. Section 6.2.2 of the Federal Agreement requires absolute consistency between the submitted team structures and the original project intent. Charlie said, his voice calm and steady. Any material deviation without written, mutual consent is a compliance violation that can trigger disqualification. The Kincaid team tried to brush it off as a clerical error, but the wheels were already in motion. The next morning, Evelyn Croft walked into Charlie's office. She carried the original partnership agreement. "We have reviewed the files, Charlie," she said. "Kincaid's unilateral removal of your name from the final submission is a direct breach of Clause 9.1. Furthermore, the evidence of unauthorized file access by Bradley Kent constitutes a clear breach of fiduciary duty." She explained that because Kincaid had acted in bad faith, accessing secure directories and plagiarizing proprietary work, the partnership was legally void ab initio. The contract was nullified from the beginning, as if it had never existed, freeing Apex Operations from any obligation to Kincaid Group. This meant that Kincaid had no legal claim to any of the frameworks or schedules developed by Charlie, and Apex was free to pursue the bid independently. Apex's legal team immediately drafted the formal withdrawal document, citing the multiple breaches of fiduciary duty and the ethical violations committed by Kincaid's leadership. The lawyers worked through the night, polishing the language to ensure that Apex Operations was completely insulated from Kincaid's impending collapse. The final pitch meeting with the Federal Review Board commenced in a prestigious mahogany-paneled conference room. The atmosphere was formal, with 3 Federal Review officials sitting across the table. One was a tall man with a dark suit and gold-rimmed glasses. Another was a woman in her late 50s with a stern expression. And the third was a younger auditor who took notes on a digital tablet. Lisa and Paul from Kincaid began the presentation, confidently clicking through slides that contained Charlie's stolen frameworks. When Paul finished explaining the slide on parallelized task clusters, Larry Fowler stood up. Larry closed his binder with a firm snap. "Apex Operations withdraws from this joint proposal on ethical grounds," he announced, his voice echoing in the silent room. The federal officials looked up in shock, their pens hovering over their notebooks. The lead official, Margaret, adjusted her glasses and asked Larry to confirm that this withdrawal was final. Larry confirmed it, and Margaret immediately directed Kincaid's team to stop their presentation and close their laptops. The Kincaid representatives froze, their expressions turning from confidence to sheer panic. Gerald Higgins opened his mouth to protest, but Apex's legal counsel immediately presented the compliance audit. The packet detailed the unauthorized sandbox access, the stolen proprietary wording, the ageist comments made by Brenda Shaw, and the history of hostile behavior. The evidence was irrefutable, and the Federal Review officials reviewed the logs with grim expressions. They asked Kincaid's representatives to explain the unauthorized Saturday login, but Gerald and Bradley could only stammer in silence. Charlie watched as Gerald's face turned red with anger, while Bradley sat slumped in his chair, unable to look anyone in the eye. Security personnel stepped forward to ensure that the meeting ended without incident, guiding the panicked Kincaid team out of the room. The Federal Review Board took less than an hour to make their decision. Kincaid Group's bid was immediately disqualified, and the company was flagged for a formal federal ethics audit, which would likely lead to debarment from future government contracts. Because Apex Operations had proactively withdrawn on ethical grounds and exposed the misconduct, the board granted Apex a 30-day extension to submit a revised, independent proposal. Kincaid's dreams of a $500 million contract had turned into a corporate disaster. They would spend the next several years defending themselves in federal court, and their reputation was permanently ruined. The corporate name of Kincaid would become synonymous with bad faith and compliance failure, serving as a warning to other firms who believed they could cut corners and steal work from their partners. Larry Fowler turned to Charlie in the hallway. "We need you to lead this bid, Charles. The entire project is yours. I want to apologize for not listening to you sooner. You saved our company from a complete disaster." Charlie Vance offered a quiet, professional smile. "I will have the revised proposal ready by Monday," he said. He walked toward the elevator, his notebook tucked under his arm. He had dismantled a $55 million competitor and secured a $500 million contract for his company, all without raising his voice. He had proved that in the corporate world, the quietest professional is often the most dangerous. He pressed the button for the lobby, feeling the cool breeze of the morning air. The storm had passed, and he was the only one left standing. He knew that Kincaid's downfall was entirely self-inflicted, a direct result of their belief that they could ignore compliance and treat people as disposable assets. Charlie had simply held up the mirror of the law, and the reflection had shattered their dreams. He walked out of the building, ready to draft the winning proposal. He knew that his victory was a triumph of diligence and ethics over arrogance and shortcuts, proving that sometimes silence really is the ultimate chess move. As he stepped onto the busy sidewalk, he felt the warm sunshine on his face and took a deep breath. For the first time in 18 months, he felt completely at ease, ready to lead his own team to a clean, well-deserved victory. He would build the new proposal with absolute integrity, and this time, his name would be at the very top of the page.